I don't know about anyone else, but watching the last 15 or so laps of the Austrian Grand Prix and then experiencing the post-race chaos almost made me feel, for better or for worse, as if I was back in 2021. There is a lot to talk about, specifically about some of the racing after Max and Lando finally came to blows, so let's get into it. I am going to start by actually going back all the way to the sprint, because after Lando pulled off a really good move late on the brakes into turn 3, despite the fact that he then got his whole car ahead of Max, he then decided to immediately leave the inside open into turn 4, allowing Max to quickly get back past, and even allowed Oscar to take advantage as well. Watching this live, I was stunned, because turns 3 and 4 are the best corners to overtake around Austria, and the way Lando just left the inside open, fully knowing that Max was still very close in his slipstream, I thought was seriously sloppy. To his credit, unlike a lot of drivers who would just defend themselves and tell people that they don't understand what it's like being in a car, he actually did admit that he messed up. But more than anything else, it left me feeling frustrated, because it felt like yet another small moment where, despite having the car to win, yet again he let Max off the hook. So now let's get into the race. And after what should have been their final pit stops, on lap 55 Lando went for his first move down the inside, and very different from the sprint. This time Max didn't just stay straight and definitely moved under braking just before the 50-meter braking board. Lando actually did a really good job of steering out of Max's slipstream, because in that situation when you're braking late behind another car, you lose a lot of downforce, which is part of your braking potential, and it's very easy to get into a Baku 2018 type situation when Ricciardo ran into the back of Max. The next big move came on lap 59, where at this stage, I think Lando started to get frustrated after Max was moving under braking, and also a little bit desperate, because he knew that the longer that he sat behind Max's turbulent air, the faster he was losing his fresh tyre advantage. This desperation was evident in his move, which was a really poor and way overambitious lunge into turn 3, which caused him to lock up and run wide. And despite still managing to overtake Max, he knew straight away that it wasn't a legitimate overtake, and so quickly decided to give the place back. And next up, we get to lap 63, and Lando again went for a very similar lunge, but this time, I think he managed to judge it just right. It was aggressive, it was just on the limit, but he managed to keep at least 2 wheels within track limits. However, this time it was Max who took to the runoff, maintaining the position, and in contrast, he didn't feel the need to return it back to Lando. Although this move from Lando was definitely aggressive, it's the sort of move that's been allowed if you're the driver on the inside. In fact, this is how Max won the 2019 Austrian Grand Prix against Leclerc. In that race, Max actually made contact with Leclerc, which sent Leclerc wide, and was still allowed to keep the win. I think what Lando did wasn't even as aggressive as what Max did in 2019, and so if they let Max keep that win on that occasion, I think Max was very lucky to not be asked by the stewards to rescind that place to Lando. I think at this point, that desperation and frustration from Lando that I talked about earlier was only getting bigger and bigger, and for Max, that pressure was also starting to get to his head. I mean, you could audibly hear their frustration building with one another with the amount of radio messages that these two were producing. That of course then led to lap 64, which almost felt inevitable with how messy their racing had been up to this point. This collision to me was primarily Max's fault, and it definitely warranted a penalty. But I think what's more interesting is why it happened, what it says about both of the drivers, and also some of the aftermath as well. To me, this incident was a combination of Max again moving under braking and not leaving a car's width, which I actually think can be best seen through the wide shot where he's purposefully veering left towards Lando despite the fact that it's a right-handed corner, but it's also down to the fact that Lando, as the defending driver, decided to be not compliant. And now this is a concept that people don't talk about enough in racing, because a lot of the time, it's actually the difference between us seeing a really aggressive overtake and 2 drivers crashing into each other. Often the most aggressive overtakes, which might actually be over the line, only happen because the defending driver decides to be compliant and either backs out or chooses to run wide, giving the aggressor more space. In that exact corner, whether you're the one doing the overtaking or the one doing the defending, we have seen plenty of similar incidents. Last year when Max went side by side with Carlos and was the driver on the outside, Carlos definitely didn't leave a car's width and did exactly the same as what Max did in 24. But Max in 23 was compliant and chose to run wide on the curb because he was playing the long game, even though technically Carlos was the driver in the wrong. The best example, however, was between Vettel and Hamilton in 2018. This time it was Seb doing the overtaking and Lewis on the outside defending. The important thing to know is that Lewis's mentality going into the corner isn't to either keep the place or crash at all cost. He was playing the long game and therefore chose to be compliant by running more than half of his car onto the curb, even though Seb was the one that was over-aggressive, doing exactly what Max did and didn't leave a car's width. These two photos side by side perfectly show you the difference between a driver who chooses to be compliant and therefore the overtake seems great even though it's over the limit, and a driver who chooses not to move over from someone who they feel is over the line. I think Norris, after losing out in wheel-to-wheel combat on more than one occasion up against Max, and after what happened in the previous laps, felt a huge amount of frustration and also that a certain amount of respect was lost between the two. He went into that corner with the mentality that if Max tries to move under braking again whilst they are side by side, that he is not backing out of a crash because he is not doing anything wrong by staying where he is. After the race, it was an absolute media frenzy, with Lando saying that he felt as though he did nothing wrong and Max saying the exact same thing. What I thought was more interesting was the thoughts of Christian Horner, who said, "For me it looked like there was enough space up there for Lando, and he already had the violations with the 4 strikes for track limits. It's just one of those things. You've got hard racers and Lando got his elbows out. There has been contact before with them and in the end, it cost both of them." And now, when Christian Horner, who defends Max Verstappen more than any other team principal I have ever seen defend their driver, says it's just one of those things, that means that he knows it's Max's fault, and I am very interested to see how this will play out by the time that we get to Silverstone. I think Lando Norris in Austria realized exactly what Lewis realized pretty quickly in 2021. Max Verstappen is a very, very aggressive driver, and throughout his career, he has tested the rules of racing more than anyone else, but he has also been allowed to get away with more than anyone else by the stewards. To be honest, even though I have disagreed over the years with some of Max's racing, I have never really blamed him necessarily for the precedent that it created. It's the stewards who allowed it to happen and allowed it to be seen as normal. 2021 was the ultimate case study because even though both Lewis and Max were at fault for numerous incidents throughout the season, it felt as though too many times, like in Imola, Spain, Monza, Sao Paulo and Jeddah, Max chose to run Lewis off the road, and because Lewis's style is all about consistency of scoring points, Lewis always chose to be compliant until their collision in Monza, where I think Lewis chose not to back out because he wasn't doing anything wrong by staying on the racing line, and this behavior was perpetuated by the stewards because they valued the show and entertainment over fair racing standards. This is exactly what McLaren team boss Andrea Stella said after the race, and even though I have thought about it for a long time, it was remarkable to hear a team principal say it as well. The entire population of the world would know who's responsible except for a group of people. We have so much respect for Red Bull and Max, they don't need to do this. The problem is that if you don't address these things honestly, they will come back. They have come back today, because they were not addressed properly in the past, where there were fights with Lewis that needed to be punished in a harsher way. This was a situation where I think both drivers were racing very hard, and I think both showed some pretty terrible racecraft at different moments. With Lando, although he's got this incredible raw speed and finally the car to match his talent, he's just not at the level yet, both in his racecraft and in his ability under pressure in winning positions when it comes to fighting for consistent race wins up against a driver of Verstappen's caliber. Throughout this weekend, the way he let Max by in the sprint and some of the dive bombs were really sloppy and not at all assertive or decisive. In the long run, I think this weekend will be a net positive for Lando because he is learning that despite them being friends, That respect goes right out the window when it comes to fighting for wins, and now he needs to keep proving that if Max wants to race like this by putting their fate in Lando's hands, that he is more than capable of having that crash with him again if Max wants to. As far as Max, well, we have seen this before. The fact is that more than any other all-time great driver that I know of, he has had more collisions with other top drivers than anyone else. He has had contentious wheel-to-wheel incidents or crashes with Kimi Raikkonen, Sebastian Vettel, Daniel Ricciardo, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, and now Lando Norris. That is just not a coincidence. He is one of the best wheel-to-wheel racers I have ever seen. His car control is incredible, and he has been exceptional at pushing the boundaries. And if the stewards enable him, then there's no reason why he should stop doing what he's doing. But when he is put under pressure, which has not happened consistently since Lewis did it in 2021, sometimes his driving becomes erratic, over the line, and unfortunately, because the stewards let him get away with it as most drivers usually back out, which justifies it as clean racing to them. If you don't decide to have the accident by not being compliant, then he is always going to walk over you and have you in his pocket mentally, like he has had Lando so far. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.